Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Why It Matters. My name is Tracy Kronzak. I'm Director of Innovation here at Now It Matters. Before we get going, Tim and I thought it would be really fun
Wait,
to
we're
share.
not going to introduce me?
No,
there's nothing. Okay.
There's no introduction now.
I'm Tim. I'm just the CEO. Whatever. Move on.
Like how I handled that?
I did. I think it was smooth. It was smooth. I don't think anybody noticed.
Nobody noticed that I forgot that you were here at all.
That's good. All right. No, it's good. Let's go. I love it.
Well, so before we get going, I do want to point out, and I want to leave a lot of time for our guest today, who in our finest tradition will introduce himself, but we are just past, in our recording cycle, we are just past 1 full year of Why It Matters. In that full year, we have gone from a side of our desk experiment on YouTube to fully deployed over multiple podcast subscription services. That availability, we uploaded most of our past episodes. We've now got 21 live with, by now, I've got a dozen more guests booked between the beginning of October and the end of the year for 2021. We have 2,000 listens already since late August, going live on multiple podcast services. And we are incredibly excited to start this next year of recording with some new branding that you've probably already seen if you bother to go to YouTube anymore, and some incredible guests coming up. And so now we have to think of new traditions for year 2. We've pitched Stalwart out the door, and now we will go towards, I don't know, virtuous, constant,
I don't know.
Illuminary.
I don't. Our ability to plan this has never really worked that well, so I'm pretty sure it'll just emerge.
Yes.
But I do want to say it is amazing that it's been a year. And I remember when we did our first recordings, it was just like, let's just hit record and see what happens. I think that is how our first episodes were made. And so I do want to say it has been a partnership, but you've really done a lion's share of the visioning for this and making sure that we've got guests, and so thank you from all of us. Thank you so much. And it's great to be a co-host with you on the show and all of that. So
maybe that's it.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. And you're upgraded from Stalwart to co-host, Tim.
Oh, okay, great.
There we go.
And Adam, you were here for it. I'm so glad.
Tim got a promotion to co-host.
I was retitled. So
now you can introduce yourself.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
I'm joined by my constant co-host, Tim Lockey.
Thanks. I'm Tim Lockey, the CEO of Now It Matters. So welcome to the show. And it's my pleasure to invite our guest to introduce himself. Adam, please tell everybody who you are.
Thanks so much, Tracy and Tim. I'm Adam Rosenzweig. I'm the Senior Manager for Product Impact at Okta on the Okta for Good team. And really excited to be here with you. Longtime listener, first time caller.
Aw, thank you.
Yeah. And we nobody would know this, so you and I got to meet in person last week at Dreamforce-ish, and it was great to meet your team. It's so interesting to finally be able to get out and about and meet people again, meet some of the others on your team in philanthropy. But I wanted to start with the question I had when you first posted in February a question or an article in response to an article that we had written. And my first question was, who's Adam and what is Okta? And then what is Okta for Good? And so if you wouldn't mind just starting with what is Okta? I think that maybe people aren't as familiar as they should be with what Okta is.
Yeah. So what you'll find on the website is that Okta is the world's leading independent identity provider. And basically what that means is we are in the identity and access management field. Identity as a type of technology helps people securely log into anything. And so we're all of us log into things all day long. We're used to doing that with usernames and passwords. Increasingly, we're used to doing that with things like two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. These concepts are becoming more ubiquitous. All of those functions belong in the space of identity.
And therefore, if I could riff on what you're saying, really, I will speak of this as we were sort of talking about immediately prior to hitting the record button. I hold a dual role. It's a very important dual role, even if it's tiny, invisible, and a pain in the neck. And that is, my wife and I co-founded Livermore Pride out here in Livermore back in 2019. And I said, oh, sure. What I want to do is revisit the early years of my career and go right back into the idea that what I'll do is be sort of the tech manager, tech support, user support, deployment support, deployment provisioning, all of these things. But for what that really means for someone like me on the ground is that you have this problem very quickly of multiple users using multiple apps with multiple means of logging in. And Okta kind of says, okay, you can do that if you want to spend your whole life navigating 60 different things for your users, or we can connect a single identity to those so that the ideal path is CTO or technology manager, whatever layer, goes straight out to user deployment all at the same time with multiple applications attached on and off with a single switch. And it's rather like, metaphorically plugging things into one of those, the little plugs, right? Where the power strip. So Okta is the power strip and the multiple plugs are your applications sitting on that power strip per user. And what that means is rather than turn them on and off independently, I can turn them on and off with the master switch on the power strip. And what I love about that idea is for a lot of nonprofits, it saves them time. And time is actually the most valuable resource on earth, believe it or not money, because time leads to money. So I'll also confess, for a long time, the Okta logo substantially reminded me of the Obama 08 logo. So I would always associate like Okta for Good with the Obama campaign. And that was, just the way it was for about 8 years.
Yes, we can.
Si se puede.
Yeah, I think that was I wasn't around when they were designing that. And I wonder if it was at all subconscious or maybe conscious. Yeah,
hope.
Hope, exactly. Yeah, the way it's interesting. I've never heard the power strip analogy, but it's a good one. And we search for metaphors constantly. I find myself searching for metaphors to describe what we do. Metaphors are a kind of storytelling, right? And people learn best from stories, or stories are a very powerful way of teaching and learning at the very least. And when we talk about something like identity and access management, most people's brains go to something else because they don't care. And they don't have a problem called identity and access management. And so we're constantly looking for ways to articulate the value of this technology, which is very powerful, but it's got to connect to where people are right now. And so sometimes we talk about the different technologies that people are using or the applications that people are using in an organization. Say your nonprofit has 10, 20, 30 different applications that over time get added on. People talk about like a Christmas tree ornament metaphor, right? That these things just sort of are eventually sort of dangly and can be somewhat unruly. As a sidebar, as a Jewish kid, all I wanted was a Christmas tree. So emotionally to sort of like, I'm now sort of trying to get like, the Christmas tree is bad in this metaphor, right? We don't want that, but in my heart, I'm sort of like, but it's so nice. But yeah, the idea is that people, every account that one has with a technology is an identity. And that's a very IT way of thinking, which is why I think most people, they don't it's not, of course, natural for them to think that way. And so when organizations ask sort of, well, I don't have an identity shapes problem. I don't have a problem called identity and access management. What I have is a time problem or a security problem or a user experience problem because I've got all these technologies, got all these people. And so when we can show them, hey, all of your people times the number of applications or devices that you're trying to manage, that's the number of identities you're actually managing. So if you have a small team with a lot of technology or a large team with a small amount of technology, whatever it is, you can still end up with an identity problem because each one of those relationships presents security risks, presents friction, et cetera, all these things. So that's the paradigm that I am constantly searching for metaphors to explain.
Got it. I will say for our listeners, Adam, you also came up on our radar screen earlier this year. Tim and I wrote a piece called 6 Questions Every Nonprofit Must Ask the Tech Industry in 2021. And it sort of created a lot of interest, but no response. And then you responded on LinkedIn and tagged us. And I was like, I don't know this guy, Adam, but he's clearly associated with the Obama campaign. And I should figure out a way to be friends with Adam. And I just want to sort of like, I want to park on that for 1 second, because one thing that is a thread is how transparent we are with our operations and the tools that connect ourselves to the world in the nonprofit ecosystem. And, I want to say thank you for responding, but I also would love to hear you dig in around the sort of very high value that transparency gives an organization like Okta, particularly when it comes to playing neutrally and well with many parties, all of which usually have conflicting interests and want to tear at each other's throats for whatever reason.
Yeah. Well, I totally appreciate that. And, it honestly, when I saw your article, it caught my eye because, of course, now I spent my career in nonprofits before I came to Okta, had been a nonprofit Okta customer twice, but now I find myself on this side of the desk, so to speak. And I saw your article and I read it. And I'm like, what are these questions? And they're great questions. And I think it honestly, it felt very natural to just want to respond and be in that conversation. I can share a little bit about the importance of that conversation, as you mentioned. But just on a very personal level, this was not a piece of strategic digital marketing for Okta. It's my privilege to be the face of Okta in a lot of nonprofit communities. Right? I am one of many, but I am often out there speaking on behalf of Okta to folks that I used to work with, right? And folks that are just like I was, right? I mean, working in organizations. And so when I took this job and came to do this kind of work, I always wanted to be able to look people in the eye when I talked about Okta and the value that it could provide. Especially nonprofit leaders who are trying to do a lot with a little and are constantly in sometimes a confrontational or antagonistic relationship with for-profit vendors. Right? We like to talk about it's all value-based, but the business models of these sectors are different, and that creates a natural tension there. And so I sort of thought to myself, well, this is also a challenge to me on sort of an existential level. How do I show up as a corporate employee now for the first time in my career? And yeah, they're great questions, and absolutely happy to get into any of them or talk more about that if you want.
What one question is, Okta for Good is the Okta.org, if you will, side of Okta for nonprofits. And so what is the nonprofit offering that Okta provides for nonprofits?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So as you mentioned, Okta for Good is the name of our social impact initiative. We're not a separate entity. We're just an operating unit inside of Okta. We're just a team. So we're not a separate foundation or a 501c3. We're just a team inside of Okta. Okta for Good was created basically when Okta went public in 2016. Okta, like thousands of other companies, took the 1% pledge, which has been a very prolific and a powerful model, especially for high growth tech companies and their founders in particular, as a way to think about, as I'm trying to build this company that is growing by leaps and bounds and is taking on venture capital and hopes to go public, how do I think about structuring my giving back over time? And the 1% pledge, has its limitations and problems, but has been a very popular and prolific model. The founders of Okta came from Salesforce. Mark Benioff and Salesforce helped to make this model popular. That's where they got the idea. So they took the pledge in 2016 and pledged 1% of our equity. It's in our S1 public filing document. People can go and see 300,000 shares of Class B common stock were set aside when Okta went public. That funds our philanthropy. We've pledged 1% of people's time. So Okta employees immediately got 3 paid days a year. That's a little bit more than 1% of their business days to volunteer for any cause they want, in addition to other things we do to help employees. And they pledged 1% of their product back to the community. 1% of product, different companies define that differently. It's a little bit more of a guideline, I would say, sort of like a spiritual guide than sort of a specific number for us. But the work that I lead here is trying to make good on that pledge, and sort of how do we make our products and technology much more accessible to the nonprofit sector. And so to get to your question about, okay, what is the offer to nonprofits? So the basic offering for any validated 501c3 or their country's equivalent is we donate 50 licenses for all of our basic products, our core workforce identity products. That includes universal directory, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and lifecycle management. These are basically all of the individual products that when you put them together enable you to make the best and get the most value from modern identity and access management. Everything after that, if nonprofits need additional licenses or products, they get a minimum 50% off whatever the published list price of that product is. And we also offer things like free passes to our conference and discounts on training, a handful of other support programs to help folks. And we're always trying to grow that menu of offerings and make it more generous and help more organizations take advantage.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, Adam? I very much really love what you just described in terms of the problem that I, as a beleaguered CTO of a 4-person organization, I'm trying to solve, right? And one of the things in the course of my career that has been a daunting and occasionally Tracy will get up on a soapbox and scream from the ramparts kind of issue to address has been, how do we look at technology infrastructure inside of nonprofits, and not just from the kind of strategic way that we want to look at it in deployment or execution or maintenance, but in funding and in supporting and in growing? Because why I would get annoyed is I would get up in front of a bunch of foundation CTOs or CEOs and be like, if you're not funding infrastructure, you're literally only funding half of a project. And nobody got that for years. I felt like people were like, shut up, crazy person. But I feel like this is catching on. And I'm wondering if you're encountering these kinds of discussions and what you would say to a philanthropic audience about the need for infrastructure, as it relates to funding nonprofits.
Yeah, it is totally the question of the day, and I appreciate that, and I have a hard time believing that anyone would refer to you as beleaguered, but we'll leave that.
You don't see my real life, Adam.
There were a lot of folks. I think part of this, to be honest, is a bit of a generational divide. There are people that are increasingly populating the ranks of all organizations, including nonprofits, who came of age in a cloud-first digital native environment, where the understanding that you will use a certain platform or technology for all kinds of programs, it's not program specific. So it's like, well, of course we have one CRM. That CRM is going to serve all of the programs in our organization. So we can't allocate the cost of that CRM to these programs in a really simple way. But there was a different way of thinking when technology wasn't cloud-based, and you could ascribe, and it was, accounted for as a capital expenditure, and you got your box of CD-ROMs, or you got your hardware, or you got your whatever, and it was a little bit easier, I think, for people psychologically to think about the traditional way of nonprofit accounting and nonprofit evaluation as funders. With this, the overhead myth, all of this stuff. I think that is the root of the problem when people think about infrastructure for technology. But I think it's changing generationally. When we do try to engage funders to talk about this, of course, Okta has a selfish interest in that as an infrastructure provider, right? That if there's more money for infrastructure, Okta is going to get some of that money, sure. But I think the value to nonprofits is that in order to serve people securely and scalably and sustainably, and to actually provide them like with a modern user experience while they're doing it, which we often think of as sort of the like price of admission to work for a nonprofit or engage with a nonprofit, is that you have to have sort of high friction in every transaction or operation, or like, oh, we're using the old version because we're a nonprofit, and people sort of like, they believe that that's acceptable. And for people who are outraged by that, we want them to have access to the same tools that commercial entities have access to. And so when we talk to funders, we explain, one, the overhead myth is anachronistic. We have to get rid of that way of thinking. It's just not, it's not useful anymore. It's not that it's wrong, it's just not the way that modern infrastructure works in a technology context. And we describe the hard savings and the soft savings that come with modern infrastructure. So the hard savings are often, well, you can just get rid of certain things you used to pay for if you start doing it this way, whether that's VPNs, or whether that's servers, or whether that was multiple products that can now be solved by a single product. So there's a hard savings to some of these things. But the soft savings, Tracy, you mentioned it at the beginning, is in people's time.
Yep.
Which is very hard for a lot of nonprofits to account for on paper, because their budgets are set beginning of the year and they're not used to time allocating. Some of them are not. But to be able to say, what we end up finding is the more poignant way or salient way of talking about this with nonprofits is capacity building, which is another phrase that lots of people use and to mean different things. But to say, look, if you have a person on your team, let's just take Okta for example, we'll speak on behalf of Okta, and they're spending, let's say you've got a Tracy on your team, right? And you don't want Tracy to become beleaguered. And so rather than—
I think I just created the word of the day.
I thought it might go ramparts, but I think beleaguered is it. So yeah,
we're inadvertently making it a thing. Then it takes a lot of time to create and configure user accounts. Yep. If you can automate that, then you've created more capacity for Tracy. And by that, you've expanded the size of your organization's pie. And that, I think, resonates with folks, and they understand, oh, right, someone just gets more efficient.
It's funny you were saying efficient right there, because I was just thinking about how in movies where they're deciding on what's going to happen in a war, and they say that's just acceptable collateral damage, which is just horrifying to hear. What I think what happens in nonprofits all the time is that there's collateral inefficiency that's just accepted, right? There's just it's just the way it is. And so I agree with you on the efficiency being a place that lands. But what's interesting about part of what you're saying here in it being generational is that the mindset of the decision makers does not match the mindset of your early entry, staff in nonprofits. And so I don't think I had thought of what that's going to look like in the next 5 years. But what you're going to see is that generationalism is going to cause people at the bottom to be so frustrated at the crazy decisions being made because of the mindset that exists at the top.
Yeah,
Um, and
it's
if leaders don't start adjusting mindset, they're
yeah.
going to be completely out of sync with staff coming in.
There are it creates shadow IT.
Very
Yeah.
much so.
Oh yeah.
There are people who will just start using stuff because they want to do their work, they want to do it quickly, and they will just create accounts and they'll reach for the tools that they need and outside of the command and control structure. And this creates, in some ways, this is great. It's a great way of working, and it creates problems right at different times. I recently got to work with an amazing woman in Canada. She's in a fellowship program that I get to run at Okta, the Nonprofit Technology Fellowship. She's a longtime consultant in the charity world in Canada. Her name is Anya McGlynn, and she wrote an article Inside Philanthropy recently where she talks about the vulnerability that is required for many leaders in the nonprofit world to talk about technology.
Yes.
We were talking about, Tim, people are used to being experts, and they are experts in many things. And, it's natural to feel insecure about all of the change and the innovation and the new shiny. And so, that's just human. And that's something that if we allow that into the conversation, right? If we allow people, let's not use acronyms without defining them when we can, and let's sort of define all of the processes that we use, and let's allow for the fact that just because someone doesn't necessarily know some latest technology thing, it doesn't mean that their expertise is invalid.
I'm so glad to hear that. I saw that you posted that on LinkedIn, and will for sure go back and read it now. But, it triggers for me something that we've started talking about as myth versus mindset. And one of the big mythologies in nonprofits is that I hear as consultants so many times is I don't know how to turn on a computer, so I can't lead technology, right? And that widespread leadership abdication, the long-term effects of that are so invisible, and so I just think you don't ever hear a nonprofit leader say, like, I didn't study accounting, so I can't do the budget, or I'm going to hand the budget off to a
Oh,
volunteer
I have.
this
Trust
year.
me.
Oh, okay, well, that is so terrifying. I do not even want to know that you have heard that. But it's at least like less often, right? Like everybody kind of knows. The board of directors is like, hey, your job is the budget, right? That's yours. Um, unless executives engage their leadership on technology, we're stuck. And so shadow IT is one of the outcomes from that. But I also think the core there is, when you think about accounting, you can sum it up, the whole thing, in 5 words: more money out than in. Right? So you know what you're trying to do with it from the beginning. And I would say one of the biggest issues is that leaders don't know what the core objective of technology is to begin with. And so, they replace it with all of these other things. So if you've got, like in the budget world, like staff spending appropriately is a good thing. It's just not the main thing, or, departmental, alignment. And in the same way, I think that leaders end up replacing good things rather than the main thing. So good things are like staff that aren't complaining, or accurate reports, which are really good things, or appropriate technology. But the main task has to be data-driven decision making, right? That the whole point of all of the stuff that we're doing here is data-informed decisions. And if leaders start understanding that, I think you could start to see them accept, like, oh, okay, well, I can get around this as the main, I can get my mind around this as the main thing. So anyway, I got really excited about that. But I'll read that article. Is that what you're seeing out there as well? Do you feel like you see leadership abdication? Do you feel like the effects of that are long term?
I don't know if I would necessarily say leadership abdication, or at least I haven't seen it. But I heard someone say once, I don't know if I necessarily believe in this, but that sort of anytime a company has a chief innovation officer, they're not an innovative company, because what ends up happening is it becomes like that one person or that one team's job to be innovative and everyone else is off the hook. So I do wonder to what extent leadership's relationship with their technology leaders or their technology team, such that they have one. So a lot of organizations don't have one, right? There's just somebody has to do it, even though it's not their job title. I wonder to what extent that creates a mindset that technology is somebody's job, which means it's not everyone else's job.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to say, as director of innovation. So first of all, Tim, I need to change my job title.
Yeah,
I think
totally.
vice president of strategy would be fine.
No, because then all of
But
us have to do technology.
as the director of innovation over here, I can say, yes, occasionally you do feel that pressure. You're like, okay, pony, run. And I'm like, but the pony doesn't want to run today. The pony's tired. The pony's already thought through a lot of things. Can we just go through the things we've thought of first? Right. Yeah. But, it's funny because, Tim, you were taking that tack of where this can go and how this represents and shows up in leadership. And I was kind of unpicking this in my mind in a different direction, Adam, and that is, the hard part about technology infrastructure in the 2020s is that it does feel ethereal. It's not, I need an X serve. I can buy that X serve. I can predict it will last for 5 years. I can deprecate it accordingly. It's a lot of subscription delivery. It's a lot of identity management, right? But the metric that you've surfaced here, I think, is important for philanthropists to note, because you can't say to a nonprofit, well, you can, but they don't. You can't say to a nonprofit, we're going to give you $100,000 grant, and we're going to increase that by 20% to cover the costs of technology, right? That would be a miracle. I would love that. For any foundation listening, that's exactly what's necessary. But in the absence of that, I think philanthropy lacks a hard metric to hang its hat on. And the hard metric that you're surfacing here isn't the thing, it's the time, right? It's the measurement of time saved and time lost. And I think that's really interesting to dig into, because the culture of change, the outcome of the culture of change as an implementation consultant is generally business process reengineering, which may or may not save time, by the way, to Tim's earlier point. But time is the thing that we save. That's almost something that could be measurable from a philanthropic lens in a new way.
It is. I think time is a big one. It's certainly not the only, but it's a really big one. It's one that every organization shares in common. We could talk about security and privacy as also being almost ubiquitous. I think in some ways, I think that there's a simple yet revolutionary answer to funding tech infrastructure. In the past, when technology was a one-time purchase, you could pay for it with a one-time grant. If technology is subscription, philanthropy should be subscription. The funding needs to follow the model of what it's paying for. It just simply is a mismatch now.
Yep.
You have a recurring technology cost with a one-time funding. It sort of very obviously doesn't fit, which sounds very simple, but is totally revolutionary in the nonprofit world. So instead of saying, here's a grant for one thing, say, you're in our portfolio, that means we're subscribed to you the way that you are subscribed to Salesforce or AWS or Okta. And so our funding of you is, at a certain level, right? We agree to that, but it is in perpetuity until you fire us as your funder, right? And
I love that, because it also gets out of the prior solution, and that is, can we just make a multi-year commitment, please?
Yeah.
But it turns out foundations are sort of time horizon driven to 6 months or less anyhow. So can't,
It's easier said than done for sure. And we
yeah.
even Active for Good team, only in the last 2 years ago, we started making multi-year grants. That's sort of the best that we can do. In the corporate world, it's also hard. People, we don't have those kind of accounting structures, right? We're sort of limited by our creativity by, when people need to project, and sort of in perpetuity is very tough. So you can say, okay, well, is 10 years long enough? Does that feel like perpetuity for now? And then we'll kind of revisit. Is 5 years enough? But that's the way that I think organizations need to be thinking. Otherwise, we're just going to constantly be feeling like we're wearing clothes that don't fit.
Adam,
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody talk about a mismatch like that. I think is net new to me, and it's really interesting. Is this out there, it being talked about in philanthropy right now?
Or
Is
did you
that,
just make it get out there? Because that would be amazing.
yeah, right.
I don't know if I can take credit for that. I'm sure that there are people out there that are. I mean, certainly, this idea of the mismatch in the funding versus the business model is there. I don't know if people are using a term like subscription philanthropy or something like that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
What,
You heard it here first,
so,
folks.
yeah, right. So I'm really intrigued by how the accounting structure would limit that. So I don't know if you meant to get into this, but we're both like I can see Tracy and I are both wait a minute we're gonna get in. That's so.
Well,
What does the limit come from on that?
so companies have unrealized obligations that sit on their books as a liability, right? So the question is, how big do you allow that liability to swell? I think that's like the fundamental question. If Okta is going to sign itself up to fund a nonprofit for a much longer period of time, then that changes where the value sits on the balance sheet. Does it sit above or does it sit below?
Oh, wow. All the lights just went on because in the corporate world, size of liability is a factor considered in acquisitions. And in the philanthropic world, that liability can't be appropriately accounted for in the way that foundations are mandated to give away a certain percentage of their holdings every year. Yep. All the lights just went on.
Well, but doesn't that match up with an endowment model? So maybe that's true of a corporate model like that. But if you have an endowment model and you basically are like, we know what our return is within a certain amount. So as long as we kept the subscription funding within that amount, like then it does line up, right?
It's an annuity. And we
Exactly.
have models for
Right. Yeah. I also am I don't I mean I think 5 to 10 years, 5 years would be a huge shift in the market. 10 years I think is too long to predict anything.
Yep.
And perpetuity I think is problematic
Foolish.
because
Yeah.
but that doesn't decrease the value of just aligning even at a mindset level. Look, you need this to be an ongoing thing, because what we run into all the time is, oh, we're going to get this thing done and then we're not going to have any more expenses related to it. And I'm the one that gets to navigate that conversation, because the platform marketing is not going to raise that, and the grant funders know it, but they're not raising it either. So they let us be in the room to have that weird conversation about like, nope, this expense is not going away. And I've seen that shift some over the last 10 years, but not into realistic levels, just like, like there's
the community that really understands this well, where we've learned a lot of this from, is in the Technology Association of Grantmakers, TAG.
Yep.
It convenes the type of folks that sort of are in that community are the CIOs of big foundations, because they have a very unique seat and they understand the role of technology in an organization, because they're, at the end of the day, just a CIO in a nonprofit, so they totally get it. But it's not just any nonprofit, right? It's a funding organization. And so they, I think, are going to be the most important advocates, because they can speak to their own funder community. And at the end of the day, there's so much more money in from institutional and private foundations than there are from corporate funders. Right?
Yeah.
So that's
Agreed.
we make up a
Yeah.
very small portion of the philanthropic dollars that are out there, and so we know that, but we also play by a slightly different set of rules. So on our team, what's been really great to see is thinking about, well, what license or privilege do we have that those traditional funders don't? And we can talk to them behind closed doors and try to talk about how they might evolve and have sort of towards a paradigm shift in the way nonprofits are supported to use technology. But we don't have nearly the same level of oversight that they do. Right? Okta for Good doesn't have a public board of directors. You have to publish minutes or get rid of a certain amount of money. There's just so much that comes with being a foundation, and so we can be the risk capital. And so that's what we've tried to do with our money. Is we have lower reporting requirements. We try to lift that burden from our grantees. We fund things that aren't proven out yet very often, which is like, it sounds so simple. And you're like, well, in fact, the entire technology world is funded. Right? It is basically built by venture capitalists paying for stuff that's not proven yet. So it's very natural for us, but in the nonprofit world, it's anathema. And so we are trying to demonstrate with public granting to say, hey, look, it's not so scary.
Well, the sort of older, because you gave a great history and culture lesson earlier, and honestly, the older kind of cultural artifact that I think I ran into when I was doing on the ground technology management. Yes, my dog is visiting our podcast right now. The thing that I ran into was that can't fail kind of myth. That's another one of the myths out there. And you could say at a high level, it's connected to, the way that funding cycles work, right? Because you get a grant, you do the thing, you report on the thing, but if you don't do the thing well, you don't get the next grant, right? So you could say that can't fail mentality is rooted in that, but I think that's only part of the full analysis. I actually think that it's also driven by resource constraints and some of the leadership qualities that we've been talking about earlier. And, I really do believe that, we don't have enough conversations about failure for nonprofit tech. I mean, every big tech thing I've ever been involved with that went well and that didn't go well had a full dissection, right? It wasn't like we're only going to talk about the successful thing and do better at that. We're going to talk about the thing that didn't work, at least to some extent, so that we don't avoid, so that we avoid spending this money again doing the same thing wrong. We don't have that space, and
Well,
I
and
think the
chronic
kind of funding,
underinvestment.
yeah, and chronic underinvestment too, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
we don't have the space, and you put all those things together, the kind of funding that you're talking about suddenly becomes super important, because that is that fail-safe funding. If you fail, you are safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something else too, Adam, that I wanted to bring back to one of your earlier comments. It's even crazier when you think about, you were talking about generational differences in nonprofits, right? I think it even goes one layer deeper than just sort of generational expectations of what technology can and should deliver. I think there's a generational personalization of technology that is really coming up. I mean, this is maybe even beyond millennials. I don't know what the next labels are, but Gen A, B, C. But, at the end of the day, I grew up with technology as something that I turned on, solved a problem with, and turned off, right? The young people of today are growing up with technology as an integral part of their lives. And of course, they're going to grab every single tool available to do jobs that they consider integral to saving the environment, to raising money. So there's this deep personal expectation as well. And yeah, I'm just saying there's a lot there, and it serves to have space to unpick that.
Yeah, we talk about this very often inside of Okta, that every organization is becoming a technology organization. This is a cliche that is sort of bandied about, but it is very true. I mean, one of the organizations that we hold up as an example of this is John Deere.
Mm.
Everyone thinks of as a tractor company. They're a technology company, right? I mean, it's every organization in order to compete in the modern world, and if in the nonprofit sector there is competition, right, which we all know, so that's also true. But you can also just say, to deliver or perform in the modern world rather than compete, if that's not appropriate or if that makes anyone uncomfortable, really requires at least some kind of understanding of technology, and it's not over on the side. It's embedded in everything.
Yeah, that tracks with our work in developing a transformation methodology that is trying to deliver that type of thinking, not to just the largest, 500 million and above revenue driving nonprofits, but at mid-market nonprofits, because that's where the challenge really hits at that level. And the expectations don't adjust for any of that as well. And I think that's really challenging for those nonprofits. We see that all the time. I wanted to ask you, when we got together, we talked a little bit about partnering and developing partners for Okta. And I want to highlight that partly because I think Okta is an important part of the and not or way of thinking that we hold. And I think it's really important for partners to know how much Okta can save them time by not getting in the weeds on multiple deployments on technology, and like using the budget that organizations have for us to deliver technology in much better ways. So I'd love to hear what it looks like to be an Okta partner. Who are Okta partners, and what does that look like?
Yeah, we're in a, I don't want to say a lucky space. This was strategic from the founding of the company, but I feel lucky to have then showed up several years later and get to help advance this. But we talk about Okta's neutrality as a technology vendor, and when we mean by neutrality is we're not neutral about who your identity provider is. I mean, we would prefer to be your identity provider. But there are companies that have organizations that are using multiple identity providers, and Okta makes that easier too. But the neutrality is around everything else. The idea is that we are not going to bundle other functions of your organization and lock you in to using only our stuff. And we know that there are companies out there where that is the model, right? We don't need to talk about who they are, but that's when we say neutrality, that's exactly what that word is pointing to, is that way of doing things, which is just stay here, we've got everything you need. And that's just not the way of the world anymore, right? Best of breed is here to stay. There's always some little consolidation things here and there. But really, when you look under the covers, even after major technology platforms get bought by other technology platforms, from an infrastructure perspective, they still act like separate products. So it really is, we're in this world of where organizations need to be able to quickly adopt and deploy new things all the time. And having an identity provider or an identity solution, we can just take Okta out of this, but modern identity makes that much easier. And so to get to your question about sort of partners, our point to partners is, sure, we would love for you to build an Okta practice into your business. We would love for you to help support organizations, especially nonprofits, with affordable, high quality, trustworthy services to help them get up and running on Okta. I tell people that like Okta is easier than Salesforce, harder than Google to implement. Like very quickly give my nonprofit folks what am I signing up for here when I go to be an Okta?
That's like a perfect measuring
stick. That's
like
great.
That.
Yep, well done.
We're somewhere in the middle, and I'll never say, oh, it's just turnkey out of the box. All these like trite things. Like, no, it's not. It's complicated. It can be hard. There's a lot of new concepts, but it is built for a non-developer kind of audience. Anyway, a lot of nonprofits still need a lot of help with this, and so we go to partners and we try to make a market for them and say, we will send you many nonprofits who need your help. We need you to give them a rate that they can afford. And the pitch is, Okta is a gateway to a future of technology adoption and usage, which is good for your business as a partner. Right? That if
Yep.
you are trying to help nonprofits adopt and use technology over time, then put something in place that makes all of that easier in the future. Take it out, add a new one, add new users, configure stuff. So that's the approach to those partners, and to say, continue to use and recommend and manage whatever other technologies your customers need. Right? We're all driven by what the nonprofits tell us they need. And people, I think a lot of partners want to, they're trying to pick their expertise and their lines of business based on where there's demand and where there's utility. Tim, one of the things that we talked about last week, that I asked you was are you and your teammates agnostic, right, about the technologies that nonprofits use? And you said, I forget exactly the words you used. I was hoping that I could look it up. You said informed. Did I get that right? So we're not agnostic.
Yeah.
We
Yep.
are informed, which I think is great, right? Which is, you're not, as experienced practitioners, you don't want to let a nonprofit drive itself off a cliff and make poor decisions, right? So there is value to your expertise and experience in that you can bring informed guidance, which is great, but also recognize that it's going to look a little bit different for everyone, and some CRMs might not be right, and some analytics platforms, et cetera. And so anyway, we want to have that same approach and mindset.
It's funny that you
Adam,
raised that, because I just
yeah.
back-channeled Tracy and said neutrality is so much better than tech platform agnostic. I was like, I love neutrality. So we're in so much alignment with everything you just said.
Yeah.
Just really glad to have that articulated so well. And it's also great to hear that from a tech provider, not just another partner. And so, yeah, thank you for thinking that way. It makes sense to your business model, but I have a feeling like that's native to how you would think about it anyway.
I want to give airtime to one more thing before we wrap up. First of all, for our listeners, one of the recordings that came out right before this one was a conversation with Tim Sarantonio from Neon One, and we dig in a lot on that idea of best of breed, like the un-CRM, there is no CRM, the best of breed, the analytics, etc. And we also had the privilege of having Chantal Forster on an earlier recording earlier this year, who is the CEO of Tag. And wow, she is a tour de force. And if you haven't listened to that one, please listen to that one. But Adam, I would love to end on something that I think is incredibly special about what you're doing. And that is, you are teaching tech for good. And I want to make sure we cover that.
Yeah. So I feel very lucky to be doing this. So those listening at home that are not following my actions on LinkedIn every day, I talked about my lack of influencer following, which is totally fine. So I've been teaching for the last couple of years at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, and it's currently October, and so this fall semester I have the privilege of co-teaching a class called Designing Tech for Good with another guy named Dave Rocklin, who is an experienced instructor as well. And it's so funny because we sort of take this for granted, that we're like, well, of course this is a thing, and you can teach it, and there's no one right way to do it or teach it, but like this should absolutely be taught. And it's a little revolutionary up there, I'll be honest. But I think we hit on a vein of demand that as a business school, they were not serving among the student population. We have all of these ambitious young leaders who come to the Bay Area to attend this prestigious business school, and increasingly, this is really heartening. Actually, this is not just marketing. They are not just sort of eager to be in the social impact world. It's actually broader than that. They're eager to go into all kinds of careers, traditional business careers, social impact careers, but it is a given that they will do it as mission-driven leaders. That is actually the amazing thing. So some of them, they want to figure out how to get a job like mine, and that's fine. You have social impact in your title, and you ever do that. But a bunch of them, most people are not going to do that, right? They're going to go do other things. And so what we're teaching is not how to start a social venture or a nonprofit. It is not how to build purpose-driven tech from the beginning. It is, if you're in a commercial business that has a single bottom line to begin with, as you find yourself in leadership positions, how do you leverage what you've built and the capabilities of your technology to solve social problems sort of after the fact? Because that's very often what is going to happen for most of these folks now. Maybe one day we'll be at a moment historically where every company that started as a double bottom line or triple bottom line company or something, but that's not the world that today's MBAs are graduating into. And so it's a lot of fun. We start with some history. I was a history major. I'm very partial to the importance of history and helping us understand the world that we live in today and how to make it better. And so we talk about the role of the corporation throughout time. It's basically, when you cut to the heart of it, a lot of these conversations are about what role should companies play in the world? What should we expect of companies? And then we start talking about the time when people started to use phrases like corporate social responsibility and social impact and tech for good. And we have them read Milton Friedman from 1970.
Oh, fantastic.
And they're like, this guy's nuts. And I say, yeah, I think but it's important because many people, including, like the presidents of the United States for basically ever, agreed with him. So it's very important that we understand sort of that argument. And then we have them read Mark Benioff, sort of responding to Milton Friedman, also in the New York Times, but 40 years later, talking about the business of business is more than just business. As sort of this is a new chapter. It's really just a cultural paradigm shift. And so we talk about things like, the Pledge One playbook and sort of structures to do this. But the course is then project-based. We just have real companies come in with projects. And so this semester we've got companies like Dell, Autodesk, Electronic Arts. These are established companies. These are not scrappy little upstarts. And I guarantee these are companies that were maximizing shareholder value above all else for a very long time. But they want to do good. They're already doing a lot of good, and the students get to work alongside them and practice that.
That is incredibly heartening. I was snarkily thinking you should also make them read Atlas Shrugged, but that's just a torture, and that's just a torture.
Right.
I could get students to actually read a book cover to cover.
Adam, I cannot say enough thank you for your time today. We covered so many bases today and so methodically. Thank you for bringing a lot of new concepts and fresh ideas to our listeners, and thank you.
Totally my pleasure. This is very fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Tim Lockey.
I'm Tracy Kronzak, and you've been listening to Why It Matters.
Why It Matters is a thought leadership project of Now It Matters, a strategic services firm offering advising and guiding to nonprofit and social impact organizations.
If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, check out our playlists, and visit us at nowitmatters.com to learn more about us.